I spent all my savings, $250,000, to pay off my parents' mortgage, but they sold the house without telling me to travel. My parents lived in another city, quite far from where I lived with my own family. Because of the distance, I only visited them on holidays for the most part. Still, despite the miles between us, I never stopped worrying about them. I spent years grinding, working overtime, cutting back on everything just to save. Every extra dollar went into my goal, helping my parents. They were drowning in debt, barely holding on to their house with a /$250,000 mortgage that loomed over them like a dark cloud. They had sacrificed everything for me growing up, and I wanted to give something back. The day I walked into the bank and made that final payment was one of the best moments of my life. I could still hear the relief in my mother's voice when I told her. My dad, the man who had always carried our family's burdens without complaining, actually broke down in tears. They hugged me, thanking me over and over, telling me I had given them a new life. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had truly made a difference. I had given my parents a future without fear, without stress. For a while, everything seemed perfect. They were happy. I was happy. But then little things started to feel off. It began subtly. My mom started texting me less, but when she did, it was always something about a new trip they had taken. Photos of them at the Grand Canyon, sipping wine in Napa, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. I remember staring at those pictures, trying to make sense of it. Growing up, we never took trips. We never had the money for luxuries like that. My dad was always the practical one, saving every penny. Now, suddenly, they were traveling the world like retirees with a fat pension. Then came the expensive purchases. My dad, who used to wear the same sneakers until they had holes, was suddenly sporting designer shoes. Mom was flashing jewelry she'd never have looked twice at before. I asked them how they were managing all these expenses. They laughed it off, saying they were finally living for themselves. I should have felt happy for them. They had struggled for so long. Hadn't they earned some enjoyment? But something gnawed at me. The math wasn't adding up. Then one day, I decided to surprise them with a visit. I drove up to their house, expecting to see their old beat-up cars in the driveway, the house I had worked so hard to save. Instead, there was a sleek black SUV I didn't recognize parked in front, a stranger's car. My stomach twisted as I reached for my phone and called my mom. She picked up, her voice calm, almost too casual. When I told her I was outside, there was a pause. Then she said, "Oh, sweetheart, we don't live there anymore." The world tilted. My vision blurred for a second. What? I managed to get out, but she just kept talking, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "We sold the house a few months ago," she said, as if it was nothing, as if it wasn't the house I had worked my entire life to save for them. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath shallow. What happened to the house? I asked again, but this time there was a tightness in my throat, an edge to my voice I couldn't hide. She sighed lightly before continuing. "We decided it was best for us, sweetheart. We moved to a smaller town nearby, and we're much happier here. You can come visit us anytime." Driving to their new town felt surreal. The roads were unfamiliar, the neighborhoods different. I had imagined their new place 100 times in my head, picturing something modest yet comfortable. But as I pulled up, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The house was small but pristine, almost too perfect, like something out of a lifestyle magazine. It didn't match the parents I had grown up with, the ones who always talked about practicality over appearances. Stepping inside, I expected to feel warmth, but instead, there was a strange hollowness. Everything was new. The furniture, the decor, even the way the light hit the floors felt staged, detached. They had built an entirely different life, and I was only now getting a glimpse of it. I wasted no time. I asked them outright, what happened to the money? Why sell the house I had worked so hard to save? At first, they danced around the question, talking about how change was good, how they wanted something different. But I pressed harder, refusing to let it go. Finally, my mother exhaled and looked at me the way she did when I was a kid asking too many questions. They had used the money to fund their new lifestyle. The trips, the fancy dinners, the sudden wardrobe upgrades. It had all come from selling the house. My father barely met my eyes. He looked uncomfortable, as if realizing too late how it sounded when said out loud. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was the house they had called home for decades. The house they once swore they would never leave. And yet, they had sold it off, spent the money without a second thought, and never even told me. I asked why they hadn't at least mentioned it. My mother gave me the kind of answer that made my stomach turn. They had wanted to live for themselves for once, to finally enjoy life without obligations. And then she said something that burned into my brain like a brand. It was family money. We did what we thought was right. Family money. As if my years of sacrifice, my sleepless nights, my every decision revolving around their well-being had been nothing more than a shared resource, something to be used as they saw fit. Not once had they considered that I might have deserved a say in what happened. Not once did they think to ask me if I was okay with it. I sat there, feeling like a fool, like everything I had worked for had been erased in an instant. The worst part, they didn't even seem to feel guilty about it. That was the moment I realized I wasn't part of their future plans. I was just another person in their past who had served his purpose. And now, they had moved on, sitting in their pristine new living room. I tried to keep my composure. The words churned inside me, but every time I opened my mouth, their calm, dismissive expressions made my blood boil even more. They didn't understand, or worse, they didn't care. I laid it out clearly. I wasn't asking for the money back. It was never about the money. It was about trust, about respect, about the fact that I had spent years sacrificing for them, believing I was doing something good, only to find out they saw it as just another transaction. They brushed it off, saying I was overreacting. They even tried to lighten the mood, as if I had shown up with some petty complaint. My mother, with that same patronizing tone she used when I was a kid throwing a tantrum, assured me it wasn't a big deal. It's not like strangers took the money. It's family. It's us. That was supposed to make it better? Like their betrayal was somehow excusable just because we shared DNA. I pushed harder, trying to make them see how deeply they had hurt me. They had made this decision without a single conversation, without even considering how it might feel to the person who had made their new life possible. But they just stared at me unbothered, like I was some naive child who didn't understand how the world worked. My father finally spoke up, shaking his head like I was the one being irrational. The house had become a burden, he said. Maintaining it, living in it, it wasn't making them happy anymore. They had done what was best for themselves. We're finally living, he added, like it was some profound revelation. I realized then that there was no getting through to them. They weren't sorry. They didn't think they had done anything wrong. In their minds, this was just the natural order of things. I had given, and they had taken, and that was that. It wasn't even anger I felt anymore. It was something heavier, something sinking deep into my bones. A kind of realization I couldn't unsee. I thought back to all the times I had put them first, the years of extra shifts, of canceled vacations, of pushing off my own dreams because I believed I was doing something greater, something selfless. They had told me over and over how grateful they were, how they could never repay me. And now they sat there, sipping their expensive coffee in their designer chairs, telling me they deserved this. They had used me, and they didn't even have the decency to feel bad about it. As I looked at them, I realized something else. They weren't going to change. There was no guilt, no remorse. This was their truth, and I wasn't part of it. The weight of that hit me harder than anything else. I had spent so much of my life taking care of them, believing I was doing the right thing. And now, as I sat in front of them, feeling like an outsider in their perfect little world, I finally saw it for what it was. I had never been part of their future. I had just been a means to an end. Driving home, I felt hollow. The road blurred in front of me, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. I had spent years believing I was doing something good, something noble. Now, I just felt like a fool. When I walked through the front door, my wife immediately knew something was wrong. I didn't have to say much. She listened, her face shifting from confusion to anger to quiet understanding. She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't try to justify their actions. She just placed her hand on mine and said she was sorry. And somehow, that was the first thing that felt real all day. The next few weeks were different. Something inside me had changed. Conversations with my parents felt forced, like I was talking to strangers who happened to know my childhood memories. I stopped asking how they were doing because I didn't care to hear about their next vacation or their newest expensive purchase. The thought of them sipping wine in some luxury resort with the money I had spent years earning made me sick. I tested the waters once. I brought up the idea of fairness, of maybe them considering reimbursing at least a fraction of what they had taken. The way they laughed, casual, dismissive, was the final nail in the coffin. To them, it was ridiculous to even entertain the thought. I was their son. This was how it worked. They had raised me, and now it was my turn to give back. That's just how family operated in their minds. That was it. That was the moment I realized these weren't people I could ever fully trust again. It wasn't just about the money. It was about how little they thought of me, how easily they had used me and expected me to just accept it. I stopped reaching out. When they called, I let it go to voicemail. The first few times they left messages asking why I wasn't answering, if everything was okay. But I couldn't pretend anymore. I had spent my entire life being the dutiful son, the provider, the one who put everyone else first. And for what? So they could treat my sacrifices like a gift they were entitled to? Eventually, they stopped trying. The calls became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. I wasn't sure if they were giving me space or if they had simply moved on. Maybe, in their eyes, I had served my purpose, and now they had no use for me. For the first time in my life, I understood something I had never wanted to admit. Family isn't always unconditional. Sometimes, the people you expect to have your back are the ones who will take everything you have without a second thought. And when you finally put up boundaries, they'll walk away without looking back. And maybe, just maybe, that was for the best. Time passed, and slowly, I began to rebuild. At first, it felt strange not having my parents as a central part of my life. I had spent so long prioritizing them, shaping my world around their needs, that cutting them out left a void. But instead of dwelling on what was lost, I focused on what I had gained. I poured myself into my marriage, strengthening the bond with my wife in a way I never had before. We traveled, we tried new things, and for the first time in years, I let myself enjoy life without feeling guilty about it. I pursued career opportunities one had previously put on hold, stopped saying no to things I wanted, and started living for myself instead of constantly sacrificing for others. The messages from my parents still came. Every few weeks, a text would pop up, an invitation to visit, a reminder that I was always welcome. But I couldn't bring myself to go. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been, but there was nothing left to rebuild. They had made it clear how they saw me, not as an equal, not as a son with his own dreams and desires, but as a resource, a tool to be used when needed. And I refused to step back into that role. Then one day, I heard through a mutual connection that they had run into trouble. The money they had so recklessly spent had dwindled. Poor investments, extravagant purchases, and a complete lack of financial foresight had left them in a difficult position. The safety net they thought they had created was gone. They were struggling again. The old me would have rushed in to help. I would have sacrificed, stretched myself thin, figured out some way to fix things for them. But that version of me didn't exist anymore. I had learned that saving people who don't want to save themselves is a losing battle. And I wasn't going to lose myself in it again. I didn't respond to their messages. I didn't reach out. Maybe that made me heartless in their eyes, but I didn't care. I had spent too many years being the good son, the dependable one, the fixer. And for what? To be used, discarded, and then expected to return when they needed me again? I had learned something valuable through all of this. Family isn't just about blood. It's about respect, about mutual care and appreciation. And if anyone, only values you for what you can do for them, then they don't deserve a place in your life. For the first time, I felt free.
Bye bye.